In the dead of winter, an elderly man stepped outside his cabin and froze in disbelief. 3 German shepherds, police dogs, were sitting silently in the snow, shivering, their breath turning white in the freezing air. They weren't barking. They weren't moving. They were simply staring at him, as if begging for help. He had never seen these dogs before. But the strangest part? They were wearing police canine collars. Why were trained police dogs outside his remote cabin? Why were they alone? Why were they desperately trying to get his attention? The man stepped forward slowly, confused and worried. Police dogs never leave their handlers, never show fear, never ask strangers for help. Something was terribly wrong. And when Samuel followed them into the forest, what he discovered changed everything. Stay with us, because this story will shock you. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. Snow fell heavily over the dense pine forest, covering everything in a deep blanket of white. The wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it the kind of cold that cut straight through clothing. Inside a small wooden cabin, an elderly man named Walter sat near the crackling fireplace, warming his hands and sipping a cup of hot tea. He had lived alone in these woods for more than 20 years, appreciating the quiet life far from the noise of the city. Nights like this were normal for him. Harsh winters, long silence, and endless snow. But tonight, something felt different. There was a strange heaviness in the air, a tension he couldn't quite explain. Walter glanced at the old clock hanging above the fireplace. It was past midnight, a time when no creature should be wandering outside except the occasional fox or owl. He leaned back in his wooden chair, letting the warmth soothe his tired bones, when suddenly a faint sound reached his ears. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't falling snow. It was something else, soft, muffled, and rhythmic. He frowned and leaned forward, listening more carefully. There it was again, a low, almost pleading sound carried by the wind. It made his heart skip a beat. Setting his cup down, Walter stood up slowly. At his age, sudden movements were unwise, but the sound had stirred something in him, a sense of alertness he had not felt in years. He walked to the cabin door and pressed his ear against it. The noise grew clearer, now sounding like faint whimpers mixed with short breaths. His eyebrows furrowed. What kind of animal whimpers in this cold? Most would be hiding, not wandering in a storm. Without wasting time, he grabbed his heavy coat and wrapped a blanket over his arm, just in case something needed warmth. He pushed open the door, and a blast of freezing wind slapped against his face. Snowflakes stung his skin as he stepped outside, his boots sinking into the thick snow. Walter narrowed his eyes, scanning the forest edge where the sound seemed to come from. The world was quiet except for the storm, yet the whimpering grew louder, more desperate. He took a cautious step forward, his breath forming white clouds in the air. Then he saw movement, shadows shifting against the white ground. He squinted harder, his heart pounding. The shapes grew clearer with every second, until finally he froze. Sitting in the snow, trembling violently, were 3 German shepherds, all wearing police canine collars. Something was terribly wrong. Walter stood completely still, his breath catching in his throat as he took in the sight before him. 3 German shepherds, strong, intelligent, highly trained police dogs, sat trembling in the deep snow. Their fur was dusted with frost, their ears low, and their bodies rigid from the freezing cold. They weren't barking or growling. Instead, they stared at him with wide, desperate eyes, as if silently begging him to understand something. Walter had seen many winters in these woods, but never anything like this. K9 units didn't wander alone. They always had a handler. So why were these 3 out here? And why did they look so afraid? Slowly, he took a cautious step toward them, lifting the blanket in his hands. The dogs didn't move, but their eyes followed his every motion. Their heavy breaths formed clouds of mist that rose into the frozen air. Walter swallowed hard. He could feel the cold radiating from their bodies, even from several steps away. This wasn't normal. German shepherds were tough, built for harsh conditions, but these dogs looked exhausted and frostbitten, like they had traveled miles through brutal weather just to reach his cabin. The thought made his chest tighten. As he drew closer, one of the dogs, slightly larger than the others, let out a faint whine. It wasn't aggression. It was pain. Walter's heart clenched. "Easy, boy," he murmured softly, his voice gentle. "I'm not here to hurt you." The dogs exchanged a brief glance, as if silently discussing whether they could trust him. Then, almost in unison, they lowered their heads, showing no signs of threat. Their collars glinted under the porch light, revealing official police identification tags. These weren't ordinary dogs. Something serious had happened. Walter knelt in the snow, ignoring the sting of the cold against his knees. He wrapped the blanket around the nearest dog, who shivered violently as warmth touched his body. The old man gently placed a hand on its neck, feeling the rapid heartbeat beneath its frozen fur. Whatever these dogs had gone through, it had pushed them to their limits. "Where's your handler?" he whispered, looking from one trembling shepherd to the next. None of them made a sound. Instead, all three turned their heads at the same moment, staring toward the dark forest behind him. A chill ran through Walter, not from the cold, but from the dog's synchronized reaction. They weren't just looking. They were pointing, guiding, warning. Something or someone was still out there in the snow. Walter slowly rose to his feet, his eyes following the direction the dogs were staring. The forest beyond his cabin was pitch black, its tall trees swaying under the weight of fresh snow. Normally, Walter felt safe here. These woods had been his home for decades. But tonight, the air felt heavier, colder, and strangely alive with tension. The three K9s stood motionless, their bodies stiff, their ears pointed forward. They weren't reacting like scared animals. They were reacting like trained officers sensing danger. Walter's heartbeat quickened. Police dogs didn't behave like this unless something serious had happened. He stepped back onto the porch, hoping to coax the dogs inside the warm cabin. "Come on," he said gently, pushing the door open. "You'll freeze out here." But none of them moved. Instead, the largest shepherd took one slow step forward, placing himself between Walter and the darkness behind him. The gesture was clear. He wasn't trying to enter the cabin. He was trying to protect Walter from something unseen. The old man felt a sudden chill crawl down his spine. "What's out there?" he whispered, his eyes narrowing. Walter scanned the tree-line, searching for movement. The storm made it difficult to see, but he could feel something lurking beyond the snow, a presence he couldn't explain. He tightened his grip on the blanket draped around one of the dogs. Their breathing grew more rapid, their bodies tensing even further. They weren't injured. They weren't lost. They were alert, focused, and extremely agitated. That frightened Walter more than anything. If these trained K9s were this distressed, then whatever they had encountered was no small threat. He crouched again, gently lifting the collar tag on the nearest dog. "K9 Unit, State Police," it read. The realization made Walter's stomach drop. These dogs were far from any police station. Had they run for miles? Had they escaped something? The questions piled up, but the dogs offered no answers. They simply kept staring at the dark forest, refusing to blink. Walter felt his pulse pounding in his neck. He tried once more. "Come inside, please." But the shepherds only stiffened more, their breaths fogging the air in sharp bursts. Then a soft crack echoed through the trees. The sound was faint, but the dogs reacted instantly. Ears up, bodies low, eyes locked forward. Not one moved a muscle. Walter felt his throat tighten. That wasn't the sound of wind or falling branches. It was the sound of a footstep breaking frozen twigs. Something or someone was out there, and it was getting closer. Walter's breath caught as the sharp crack echoed again through the trees. The three K9s instantly lowered into alert stances, their bodies tense, their eyes narrowed toward the forest. Whatever they had heard was close, too close. Walter felt his hands tremble slightly. He wasn't a young man anymore, and danger wasn't something he went looking for. But the dog's behavior left him with no choice. Something had driven these trained police dogs through a brutal storm to his cabin, and now that same something was hiding in the darkness. The largest shepherd stepped forward and nudged Walter's coat gently with his nose. It wasn't aggression. It was direction. A plea. He nudged again, firmer this time, then turned and took a few steps toward the tree before glancing back. The message was unmistakable. Follow us. Walter hesitated, his mind racing. He didn't know what he was walking into, and the storm had already made the night nearly impossible to navigate. But looking at their shaking bodies and desperate eyes, he knew they hadn't come all this way for nothing. Walter took a deep breath and reached inside the cabin doorway, grabbing his old lantern from the hook. Its dim glow cast a soft circle of light around him as he stepped into the snow. "All right," he murmured, trying to steady his voice. "Show me what you're trying to show me." The dogs responded immediately. All three stood and began walking slowly toward the forest, staying close together, moving with a discipline that only trained K9s possessed. There was no random wandering, no hesitation. They knew exactly where they were going. Walter trudged behind them, his boots sinking deep into the snow with every step. The cold bit into his face, and the wind whipped around him, stealing his breath. But the dogs pushed ahead, driven by an urgency he could feel even from behind them. Every few seconds, one of them would look back, checking that he was still following. Their loyalty to whatever mission they had was powerful and unsettling. Walter tightened his grip on the lantern, its light flickering as snowflakes drifted across its glass. As they moved deeper into the woods, the sound of the storm faded slightly, replaced by an eerie stillness. The trees stood tall and silent, heavy with ice. The forest floor was untouched except for a narrow trail of paw prints leading forward. Walter's heart thudded harder with each step. He didn't know what he expected to find, but he knew it wouldn't be good. Then, without warning, the dog stopped. All three raised their heads and stared at something half buried beneath the snow ahead. Walter felt his breath freeze in his chest. Whatever was there, it was the reason the dogs had come. Walter lifted the lantern higher, its trembling glow stretching across the snow-covered ground. At first, he couldn't understand what the dogs were staring at. The object half buried in snow looked like just another piece of winter debris, a broken branch, maybe, or a fallen log. But as he stepped closer, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a branch. It wasn't a log. It was a torn piece of thick fabric, stiff from the cold and stained with something dark. Walter kneeled down, brushing snow away with shaking hands. The red smear smeared across the cloth made his stomach twist. It was dried blood. The dogs stood behind him, silent and tense, their bodies pointing forward like arrows. Walter lifted the cloth closer to the lantern. The material was heavy-duty, reinforced, something used for uniforms or tactical jackets. His chest tightened. This wasn't from a random hiker. This was police-issued gear. "Dear God," he whispered, feeling dread settle inside him. If this belonged to a police officer, then whoever wore it had been injured. Badly. One of the shepherds stepped forward and sniffed the cloth, ears lowering as he whimpered softly. Walter could see the pain in the dog's eyes. This was someone they cared about. Their handler. Their partner. And that meant the injured person was somewhere out here, alone in the freezing night. Walter felt a surge of urgency. "Show me the rest," he murmured. The dogs responded immediately. They moved ahead with sudden determination, weaving between trees with sharp precision. Walter followed, his lantern swinging wildly as he hurried to keep up. The wind howled through the forest, but beneath it he could hear the crunch of snow under the dog's paws. Soon, more pieces of evidence appeared, small, unsettling clues that formed a silent story. A broken branch snapped at chest height, a glove half buried under snow, and then footprints. Large boot prints trailed through the forest, growing more uneven with each step. Some were deep, as if the person had stumbled. Others were smeared, showing signs of dragging. Walter crouched beside them, tracing the shape with trembling fingers. He was hurt, he whispered. He tried to walk, but he couldn't. The dogs circled the footprints anxiously, their breaths quick and white in the cold air. Walter stood slowly, fear pressing against his ribs. Somewhere ahead, an injured officer was fighting to survive. And in this deadly cold, time was running out fast. The K9S moved again, noses low, following the fading trail with desperate precision. Walter gripped the lantern tighter and hurried after them. Whatever they were about to find, it would change everything. Walter struggled through the deepening snow, his lantern swaying as he followed the three determined K9S. The forest grew darker, thicker, and strangely quieter. Even the wind seemed to hush as they moved forward, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. The dogs suddenly halted near a cluster of tall pines, their bodies stiffening once again. Walter approached slowly, his boots crunching through untouched snow. At first he couldn't see anything unusual, just trees laden with white, branches bending under the storm's weight. But then, as he lifted the lantern higher, a metallic glint flashed beneath the snow. His heart skipped. He stepped closer, sweeping away layers of frost with his sleeve. Beneath the snow lay the roof of a vehicle, its dark metal barely visible under the heavy accumulation. Walter's chest tightened as he brushed away more snow, revealing the distinct shape of a police SUV. Its emergency lights were off, its front half buried so deeply that only the rear windows peeked out. The dogs circled the vehicle, their whines growing sharper and more urgent. Whatever happened here hadn't been an accident. Walter moved to the driver's side, coughing as the cold air bit his lungs. When he wiped the glass with his glove, he froze. The window was cracked, one jagged line running across the center, surrounded by several small impact marks. Bullet damage. His hand trembled as he traced the cracks. A police SUV stuck in the woods, shot at, buried in snow. This was worse than he imagined. The storm hadn't hidden the vehicle by chance. Something had forced it off the road and into the trees. He stepped back, shining the lantern through another window. Papers were scattered across the seats. A radio hung loosely from its mount. The driver's door was slightly ajar, snow blown inside like someone had abandoned the vehicle in a hurry. But what affected Walter the most was the silence. No officer, no movement, no sign of life. Just a lonely, frozen car left behind in the middle of nowhere. One of the shepherds approached him, nudging his leg before turning toward a faint trail leading deeper into the forest. Walter swallowed hard. The SUV wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of something far more dangerous. Whoever had been inside hadn't just vanished. They had left on foot, likely injured, likely terrified, and possibly still alive. Walter tightened his grip on the lantern and nodded to the dogs. "All right, take me to him." The K9S didn't hesitate. They turned and began leading him toward the darkness again. Walter followed the dogs deeper into the forest, each step heavier than the last. The cold stabbed through his coat, and the snow reached nearly to his knees. But the dogs pushed forward with unwavering determination. Their noses skimmed the ground, their tails stiff, their ears constantly twitching. They were tracking someone they knew, someone they refused to give up on. Walter tightened his grip on the lantern, feeling the weight of fear press against his chest. Whoever these dogs belonged to, he had to pray they were still alive. The forest grew darker as the lantern's glow flickered across twisted branches and uneven snowdrifts. Suddenly, one of the shepherds stopped and barked sharply, the sound echoing through the trees. Walter hurried over, his breath forming shaky clouds in the air. The dog pawed at the snow, digging frantically. Walter set the lantern down and knelt beside him. As he cleared away the top layer of frost, he uncovered something half-buried, an officer's badge. The silver was scratched and smeared with dried blood. Walter froze, his heart pounding. This wasn't just any badge. It was a police identification tag from the same department marked on the dogs' collars. The other two dogs gathered around the badge, whining softly, their bodies trembling with emotion rather than cold. Walter picked up the badge and flipped it over. The name engraved sent a chill down his spine. Officer Daniel Harris. He didn't know the man, but the dog's reaction told him everything he needed to know. This officer wasn't just their handler. He was their partner, their family. And somewhere in this icy wilderness, he was fighting for his life. Walter scanned the area again, noticing deeper impressions in the snow ahead. They weren't clean footprints anymore. They were scattered, dragging, uneven. Someone had stumbled through here, losing strength with every step. The dog sniffed the trail intensely, then took off again, faster this time, driven by panic and hope. Walter forced his tired legs to move, the cold burning through his muscles. He couldn't let the dogs go alone. Not now. Not with danger still possibly lurking behind the trees. As they pushed farther, the forest seemed to close in around them. The storm muted every sound except the crunch of snow beneath their feet. Walter's breathing grew ragged, but the K9s surged ahead until suddenly they stopped again. All three stared at a spot near a fallen log, their tails lowered, ears flattened. Walter stepped closer, raising the lantern with trembling hands. And there, half covered in snow, motionless, lay the unmistakable shape of a human body. His heart dropped. They had found Officer Harris. But whether he was alive was another question entirely. Walter's hands trembled as he lifted the lantern higher, its warm light falling onto the still body in the snow. Officer Harris lay on his side, his uniform torn, his face pale from the cold, and his breaths, if he had any, were too faint to see. The snow around him was disturbed, marked by signs of struggle and long drag marks that showed he had tried desperately to move before collapsing. Walter felt his throat tighten. He had seen injured hikers before, but never something like this. This was a man who had fought to stay alive and had run out of strength. The three K9s rushed forward, circling their handler in a frantic mix of fear and hope. One pressed his nose against Harris's cheek, whining softly. Another pawed at his jacket as if trying to wake him. The third lowered his head and let out the saddest, most heartbreaking sound Walter had ever heard. It wasn't barking. It wasn't growling. It was grief, pure, desperate grief. Walter knelt beside the officer, feeling for a pulse with shaking fingers. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faint, weak, but still there, he felt a slow thump beneath his fingertips. "He's alive," Walter whispered, relief flooding through him. "Barely, but he's alive." The K9s reacted instantly, their ears perking, their bodies shifting toward him as if begging him to do something, anything. Walter looked around helplessly. They were deep in the forest, the storm was worsening, and he was an old man with limited strength. He couldn't carry an adult police officer alone. But leaving him wasn't an option, not with his pulse fading and the cold stealing what little life he had left. Walter gently touched the nearest shepherd's neck. "I need your help," he murmured. The dog responded immediately, pressing closer, ready to assist. Walter slid his arms beneath Officer Harris's shoulders and tried to lift, but his aging muscles trembled under the weight. He nearly lost his grip before one of the K9 moved behind Harris, pushing with surprising strength. Another took hold of the officer's jacket in his teeth, pulling forward. Together, old man and dogs managed to lift Harris off the ground. Slowly, painfully, they began dragging him through the snow. Every few steps, Walter gasped for air, his body burning from effort, but the dogs never stopped. They pushed, pulled, guided, refusing to leave their handler's side. Their determination was fierce, unwavering, stronger than the storm, stronger than fear. Walter felt tears sting his eyes. He had never seen loyalty like this. And as they fought their way back toward the cabin, Walter realized something powerful. These dogs weren't just trying to save their handler. They were trusting him to save them all. Walter and the dogs pulled Officer Harris through the thick snow, inch by inch, every movement fueled by sheer determination. The storm howled through the trees, but the lantern's soft glow stayed steady in Walter's hand. His arms burned, his back ached, but he refused to stop. The dogs worked tirelessly at his side, their breathing heavy, their eyes fixed on their handler with desperate hope. Walter kept whispering, more to himself than anyone else, "Hold on, just hold on." Harris's head rested against Walter's arm, his skin icy cold, but the faint pulse still throbbed, fragile but present. The group reached a small clearing where the snow seemed disturbed in a strange, chaotic pattern. Walter paused, blinking through the storm as he lowered the lantern. Something about the markings didn't make sense. Deep grooves dug into the snow, a trail of churned ice leading further away from the crash site. At first, he thought they were more drag marks. But the shape was wrong. The spacing was too wide, too heavy, too intentional. One of the shepherds sniffed the trail and growled low, his fur bristling. Walter stepped closer and felt dread climb up his spine. The tracks weren't from Officer Harris. They were from someone or something else. Walter knelt down and traced the marks, his fingers trembling. They resembled boot prints, but deeper, heavier, and scattered, as if whoever made them had been running. Mixed with them were strange indents that didn't match any footprints Walter recognized. Almost like someone had dropped heavy equipment or dragged something metallic. The storm had softened the edges, but not enough to erase the sense of danger. He wasn't alone, Walter whispered. The dogs suddenly stiffened and turned their attention to a fallen tree nearby. Their ears perked, their breaths quickening. Walter followed their gaze and noticed something under the log, something faintly glowing under a layer of ice. Carefully, he brushed away the frost. His heart lurched. It was a police body cam, still recording, its red light blinking weakly. With shaking hands, Walter pressed the playback button. The screen flickered, and a chaotic scene appeared. Officer Harris running through the forest, panting heavily. The camera shaking wildly. Someone shouting behind him. Gunshots cracking through the air. Harris stumbling, blood soaking his shoulder. And behind him, dark figures moving fast, chasing him down with cruel determination. The footage ended abruptly as the camera hit the ground. Walter's eyes widened in horror. This wasn't an accident. This was an ambush. And the attackers were still out there, somewhere in the storm. Walter snapped the body cam shut, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. The cold suddenly felt sharper, the darkness heavier. Officer Harris hadn't simply gotten lost. He had been hunted. And the people chasing him were still somewhere out in the storm. Walter swallowed hard and looked down at the injured officer lying motionless in the snow. His lips were blue, his breathing barely noticeable. Every second spent here was a second closer to losing him. The old man tightened his grip on the lantern and forced his trembling legs to move. "We have to go," he whispered. "Now." The K9S reacted immediately. One positioned himself behind Harris, pushing his body forward with powerful strength. Another gently tugged the officer's jacket with his teeth, pulling in sync with Walter's movements. The third stayed alert, ears up, eyes constantly scanning the trees for any sign of danger. Walter gritted his teeth and lifted Harris under the shoulders again. The weight was overwhelming, but his resolve was stronger. He would not let this man die out here, not while help was within reach. The snow deepened as they moved, slowing every step. Walter could feel his muscles screaming, his breath burning in his chest. But each time he faltered, one of the shepherds nudged him forward, as if reminding him they didn't have the luxury of stopping. Officer Harris's head lolled against Walter's arm, and a soft, faint sound escaped his lips, something between a groan and a whisper. It was enough to push Walter harder. "Stay with us," he urged. "We're getting you out." The storm intensified, whipping snow into their faces, but the cabin was finally within sight, its warm glow faint but unmistakable between the trees. Relief washed over Walter, but it was short-lived. From far behind them, a distant crack echoed through the forest. It wasn't the sound of a branch breaking. It was the same chilling noise he had heard earlier, the sound of someone stepping on frozen twigs. Walter's blood ran cold. The attackers were still tracking them. "Faster," he whispered urgently. The dogs responded instantly, pushing harder, their breaths coming out in sharp bursts. Walter forced his tired body to keep pace. The cabin's porch crept closer, the light growing brighter. Just a few more steps. Just a little further. The old man felt his legs give out, but he refused to fall. With one final heave, they dragged Officer Harris up onto the porch. Walter collapsed to his knees, chest heaving, but relief flooded through him. They had made it back. But the danger was far from over. Walter pushed open the cabin door with his shoulder, the hinges groaning under the sudden force. Warm air rushed out to meet the freezing storm, but he didn't stop to feel it. The police dogs helped him drag Officer Harris inside, their paws slipping slightly on the wooden floor as they refused to let go until the officer was safely over the threshold. Walter slammed the door shut behind them, locking out the howling wind. The room instantly felt too small, too tight, as the urgency of the moment pressed down on him. The officer lay limp on the floor, his breath shallow, his uniform soaked with blood and melted snow. Walter knelt beside him, pushing aside furniture with one swift arm. He spread blankets on the ground, then lifted Harris carefully onto them. The officer's skin was ice cold, his eyelids barely twitching. Police dogs surrounded him, their bodies forming a protective circle. One gently licked Harris's hand, trying to bring him back. Another rested his head on the officer's chest, listening intently for movement. Walter took a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. "All right," he muttered softly. "We're not losing him tonight." He moved quickly, fueled by instinct and the old survival skills he had learned long ago. He stoked the fire, adding log after log until flames roared brightly, filling the cabin with heat. Then he grabbed towels, dipping them into warm water and pressing them against Harris's arms and neck. The officer's body was dangerously cold, too cold. Hypothermia had already sunk its claws deep. Walter worked faster, rubbing Harris's hands, massaging his limbs, forcing warm circulation back into frozen flesh. "Come on, son, stay with me," Walter whispered. The officer's breathing hitched, almost unnoticeable, but the dogs reacted instantly, lifting their heads in hope. Walter leaned closer, listening. Yes, there it was. A faint groan escaped Harris's lips. His fingers twitched weakly. The shepherds whined, tails thumping softly against the floor as renewed energy surged through them. They pressed closer, offering their own warmth like living shields. Walter reached for his first aid box, pulling out bandages and antiseptic. He cut through the torn fabric of Harris's uniform, revealing a deep wound across his shoulder. The sight made Walter's stomach twist. It was no random injury. This was a violent cut, likely from a weapon. He cleaned it carefully, wrapping it tight to stop further blood loss. Outside, another crack echoed through the forest. The K9s instantly growled, rising to their feet. Walter froze, heart hammering. Whoever had done this to Harris was getting closer. The cabin walls seemed to shrink as the echoing crack faded into the storm. Walter froze, his breath catching mid-air, the bandage roll slipping slightly from his fingers. The K9s were no longer focused on Officer Harris. They stood rigid, tails lowered, bodies pointed toward the door like arrows locked onto a target. A deep, low growl rose from their throats, vibrating through the wooden floor. Walter felt a cold shiver crawl across his spine. He had lived through countless winters, faced wild animals, even endured storms that shattered trees, but he had never heard dogs growl like this. This wasn't fear. This was warning. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, but beneath it Walter could hear something else. Soft footsteps crunching through the snow. Slow. Calculated. Getting closer. Walter leaned forward, whispering, "Easy now, we're safe for the moment." But even he didn't believe his own words. The dogs moved in perfect formation, spreading out across the room. One positioned himself directly in front of the door, muscles tight. Another stood beside the window, ears twitching at every sound. The third hovered protectively over Harris, refusing to leave his side. Walter's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Whoever had ambushed the officer hadn't given up. They were tracking him, following the trail, hunting him all the way here. Walter's cabin, his peaceful shelter, was now the final stop in a deadly chase. He hurried to extinguish the lantern, letting only the fireplace illuminate the room in faint orange light. Shadows danced across the walls, but it was enough for the K9s to see without revealing too much to whoever lurked outside. A sudden thud hit the porch. Walter jumped, nearly knocking over the medical supplies. The dogs barked sharply, their voices echoing with raw fury. Something, or someone, had stepped directly onto the wooden boards. A second thud followed, then silence, the kind of silence that tightened the chest and froze the lungs. Walter reached instinctively for the rifle mounted above the fireplace, his hands trembling. He hadn't used it in years, but tonight, survival outweighed everything. He stepped back toward the officer, whispering urgently, "If you can hear me, hold on. We're not letting anything happen to you." Harris didn't respond. His breathing remained shallow, but the dogs did. They moved closer to the door, each step measured, their growls deepening as shadows shifted under the porch light. Then came the sound that confirmed Walter's worst fear. A hand tried the doorknob. Slowly, quietly, testing it. Walter raised the rifle. The dogs crouched, ready to strike. The attackers had found them. The cabin door rattled softly as the intruder tested the lock again. Walter held his breath, finger trembling near the trigger, while the police dogs stood coiled like springs ready to explode. Then, before the doorknob turned a third time, a faint, broken whisper rose from behind Walter. "Don't let them in." Walter spun around. Officer Harris's eyes were half open, unfocused, but filled with raw urgency. His lips trembled as he tried to speak. The police dogs immediately rushed to his side, nudging his hands, comforting him. Walter leaned closer. "Who are they? Why are they here?" he whispered. Harris swallowed, wincing in pain. "They're not hunters, they're not locals." He struggled for breath. "They're the men we were tracking, dangerous smugglers, armed, ruthless." Walter's stomach twisted. Smugglers. Criminals. And Harris had been their target. "We found their hideout," Harris continued weakly. "We confronted them. They opened fire, forced us into the woods." He coughed, his voice breaking. "I radioed for backup, but the signal died. The storm cut everything off." One of the dogs lowered his head onto Harris's chest, as if encouraging him to keep going. Harris reached a shaky hand toward the dog, barely touching his fur. "They hit the SUV. We crashed." "I told the dogs to run, get help." His voice faltered, pain rippling through him. "I didn't think they'd find someone, but they did." Walter felt something tighten in his throat. These dogs had risked their lives, braved the freezing forest, and found him, an old man living alone, because they had no one else left to turn to. "Why would smugglers chase you this far?" Walter asked softly. Harris's eyes darkened. "Because I saw something I wasn't supposed to." He forced himself upright an inch, grimacing. Inside their truck, crates full of illegal weapons. Evidence that could lock them away for decades. "They can't let me live." Outside, heavy footsteps circled the cabin, crunching snow deliberately. Harris stiffened. "They won't leave until I'm dead," he whispered. "And they'll kill anyone who helped me." Walter felt a chill far colder than the winter storm. The criminals weren't simply searching, they were closing in, determined to finish what they started. The K9s suddenly erupted into furious barking, their bodies vibrating with rage. Harris's breathing quickened. "They'll try to break in," he warned. "They know I'm weak. They know you're alone." Walter tightened his grip on the rifle, his jaw clenching with renewed resolve. "They don't know one thing," he said quietly. Harris blinked. "What's that?" Walter glanced at the three loyal shepherds. "You're not alone anymore." The next sound shattered the silence, a loud, splintering crack as something heavy slammed against the cabin door. The wood groaned under the force. The K9s exploded into action, barking savagely, their voices filling the small cabin with thunder. Walter steadied the rifle against his shoulder, the weight unfamiliar but necessary. He felt his pulse pounding in his temples. The intruders weren't testing the door anymore. They were trying to break it down. Officer Harris sucked in a shaky breath, his eyes wide with fear. "They found us," he rasped. "Get ready." Another blow hit the door, harder this time, sending dust fluttering from the hinges. The K9 standing guard lunged forward, teeth bared, ready to defend his handler with everything he had. Walter called out in a low voice, "Stay close, boys, stay close." He crept toward the door, the rifle raised, the fire behind him casting long shadows across the room. Outside, muffled voices murmured, men coordinating, preparing. One of them laughed, a cold, cruel sound. Walter felt anger rise in his chest like fire. They thought an old man and a wounded officer were easy prey. The door cracked again. This time, a jagged split appeared near the frame. Walter took his stance. The largest shepherd stepped beside him. The next blow sent the door bursting inward. A tall figure stumbled through, weapon raised, but before he could steady himself, the K9 launched forward with explosive speed. The shepherd slammed into the intruder's arm, knocking the gun aside and dragging him to the floor with powerful force. The man screamed, fighting to shake the dog off, but the shepherd held tight. Walter didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and struck the weapon away with the butt of the rifle, sending it skidding across the floor. Another intruder rushed in through the broken doorway, but Walter fired a warning shot into the ceiling, the blast echoing like thunder. The man froze, startled by the unexpected resistance. Before he could recover, the second K9 barreled into him, knocking him backward into the snow. A third shadow approached outside, but when he saw two attackers already down and two furious German shepherds fighting like warriors, he hesitated. The mistake cost him. The third K9 leapt from the shadows of the cabin, tackling him into the snow with a ferocity born from loyalty and desperation. The criminals panicked. This wasn't the outcome they expected. They scrambled to escape, slipping on ice, tripping over each other, their confidence shattered by the sudden fight back. Walter stepped into the doorway, rifle raised. "I call for help," he lied boldly. "They're almost here." As if on cue, distant sirens echoed through the stormy night. The intruders' eyes widened in terror. They turned and fled into the darkness. Police dogs chased them to the treeline, ensuring they were truly gone before returning to the cabin, panting, trembling, but victorious. Walter dropped to his knees, breath shaking. They had survived the night, but the fight wasn't over yet. The sirens grew louder until red and blue lights flashed through the trees, casting long streaks of color across the snow-covered forest. Walter stepped outside, exhausted, gripping the doorway for support. The dogs stood beside him, their bodies still tense, but their eyes calmer now that help had finally arrived. Minutes later, multiple police SUVs skidded to a stop outside his cabin. Officers rushed out, weapons drawn, until they saw the scene before them. The police dogs, battered but standing strong. The broken cabin door. The trail of fleeing criminals. And an old man who looked like he had fought a war. "Over here," Walter called, his voice cracking from cold and exhaustion. The officers hurried toward the cabin, and when they stepped inside, they found Officer Harris lying on the floor, wrapped in blankets, barely conscious, but alive. A ripple of disbelief swept through the room. One officer knelt beside him, checking his pulse, then looked up in astonishment. "He's stable, he's actually stable," he said, shaking his head. "How did he survive out here?" Walter glanced at the three shepherds, who now sat protectively around Harris. "He didn't do it alone," he said softly. Paramedics entered, lifting Harris carefully onto a stretcher. As they carried him out, his hand slipped weakly toward the K9S. All three dogs pressed close, nuzzling him with soft whines. For the first time since the forest, Harris's eyes opened just enough to see them. A faint smile touched his lips. "Good boys," he whispered before drifting back into unconsciousness. Walter followed the paramedics outside, leaning heavily against the railing. A senior officer approached him, his face stunned. "Sir, our units found two of the suspects injured in the woods. A third one nearly tore his arm apart trying to outrun the dogs. We never would have caught them this fast without your help." He paused, lowering his head respectfully. "You saved one of our own tonight." Walter shook his head gently. "No," he murmured. "Those dogs did. I just did what anyone would do." But the officer disagreed. Not everyone would have opened their door in a storm. Not everyone would have fought armed criminals. And not everyone would have risked their life for a man they didn't know. He placed a hand on Walter's shoulder. "You're a hero, whether you accept it or not." The police dogs gathered around Walter, leaning against him as though claiming him as part of their family now. The old man felt warmth rise in his chest, deeper than the fire, stronger than the storm. He looked at the dogs, then at the officers working to load Harris into the ambulance. "Take care of him," Walter said softly. "He's special." One of the dogs nuzzled his hand, a silent thank you. And as the ambulance pulled away and the dawn light touched the snowy trees, Walter realized something unforgettable. He had saved a life that night, but the dogs had saved his heart. This story teaches us that courage and kindness can appear in the most unexpected moments. Walter, an elderly man living alone, didn't turn away when he saw three freezing canines begging for help. His bravery saved a life, and the dog's loyalty proved that true partners never give up on those they love. We learn that heroes are not defined by age or strength. They are defined by their willingness to act when someone is in danger. Even in the darkest moments, compassion can change everything, and working together can overcome challenges no one can face alone.